This podcast is part of the Facebook group Just More Than Survivors of Suicide, Kansas City. Greetings and blessings whenever and wherever my brothers and sisters in Christ and fellow survivors of suicide, loss, and attempt. I am Brandy Johnson, ordained minister and fellow survivor of loss. As always, I want to thank everybody who is tuning in because, again, I am doing new things, and this takes a lot of courage. But it also means a lot to me to know that I have your support, whether or not you're directly affected by suicide. For me, knowing that these efforts are supported by a caring community makes a huge difference in being able to continue to fight, to break the stigma, and to openly talk about suicide. Today, I would like to talk about grief, and more specifically, a grief observed by C.S. Lewis from 1961 following the death of his wife, Joy Davidson. And if you're unfamiliar with Lewis, he was the author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, probably more popularly now known as the Narnia series. And his wife, Joy, I believe her middle name was Helen. In his book, he refers to her as H. Um, she was married to, I believe, David Grisham, a very famous author. You know, this is back in the 1940s, 50s. And of course, my apologies, you guys. I got wrapped up in trying to share some history with you there because not many know about Lewis and his rendition of grief following her death. You also have to understand a little bit about him. He was a very academic man, schooled very well, pretty much an atheist, maybe even a Gnostic, but more towards an atheist. And in his life, he, battled with the idea of God and eventually did come to the term that God was real and he believed in him. That's the shortest I can put that for you. So in A Grief Observed, we are seeing his point of view as a Christian, dealing with death, dealing with grief, but also an academic man, someone who would probably put himself in check uh, before allowing himself to stumble, mainly for reputation. But when he wrote A Grief Observed, it can't be said that his intentions were to publish it. It wasn't published until years later through the permission of his stepson, who he grew very close with after his wife's death, of course. There's also a movie that goes along with it. Anthony Hopkins does a newer version of it. It's called Shadowland. I prefer the older version, but in the movie, it does show a little bit at the end about their relationship. Sorry for the spoiler alert. But I prefer the book, honestly, because it's his firsthand view of dealing with the question of faith in the face of grief and dealing with the subject of loss, dealing with the subject of loss, personal loss. He wasn't married to Joy, until the latter part of his life. And he himself, probably in his late 50s, I can't remember exactly, but we're going to kind of get to the nitty gritty here, you guys. This is a hard subject for me, too. On the very first page of his book, he opens and says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid, the same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is sort of an invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. And that would be page 3 of chapter 1 in A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis from 1961. I'll be sharing a lot of sections from this today, but the book itself, 70 pages at most. Maybe 76 to be exact, and that includes an introduction from his stepson. But I think that many of us can attest, when we think about it, grief does feel like fear. The fluttering in the stomach, the restlessness, I don't know about the yawning, but I definitely know that sense of dread that can't be reversed. It's hard for that feeling to go away. Again, my apologies, you guys. Some of this is hard to deal with for me too. I'm not inhuman. It may seem easy to help share other stories, but sometimes it's always hard to deal with our own. And I will here in the very near future be sharing an episode in regards to my biological mother and my own daughter's death by suicide. But I wanted to share this by Lewis today because he explains a lot of things that I think many of us can relate to. Moving forward onto page 5, he said, and no one ever told me about the laziness of grief, except at my job where the machine seems to run on much as usual. I loathe the slightest effort. Not only writing, but even reading a letter is too much. Even shaving. What does it matter now whether my cheek is rough or smooth? They say an unhappy man wants distractions, something to take him out of himself. Only as a dog-tired man wants an extra blanket on a cold night. He'd rather lie there shivering than get up and find one. It's easy to see why the lonely man becomes untidy, finally dirty and disgusting. That's pretty impactful there. I know when we've been faced with the worst thing in our lives we could ever imagine, no other cause and effect really seems to bear as much weight, because we think to ourselves, the worst has already happened. How worse can it get? And so I think many of us can relate to that. Not just the laziness, what he termed as lazy in most cases, I would term as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And if we have compounding mental health illnesses before we go through tragedy, and even specifically tragedy of a suicide loss, in some cases, and this is going to be a very loose statement because nothing compares to losing someone, no matter how they're lost. But all of us, no matter what the situation may be, we might look at a different situation and say, well, suicide is harder than homicide, for example. I might be able to understand, because then I'd have a point of direction for anger, when and or if our family dies by homicide, then we want to seek justice through catching the person that did it. But when our family member dies by suicide, we don't we don't want to blame them. In most cases, I know a lot of us do go through the guilt. We point fingers because we're angry at them for leaving us this way, but it's just one of many examples. Family members die of cancer. At that point in time, we can point our finger and say, well, it was the disease, or it was the doctors didn't do right, the medications caused it. We have a point of anger we can direct at other than our loved one. And in most cases, maybe we can think, well, I wouldn't feel as guilty, and yada, yada, yada. But no matter what the case, grief itself is not easy to deal with. And I do not give in to a lot of cliches And so when they say that time heals all wounds, I beg to differ. I believe that God can heal us. He can take on our wounds as he already has. But I believe that sometimes in the beginning, time makes it harder because it puts us farther away from the person that we love. And I think we have to keep in mind that it also can bring us closer to them. Every day that we live and we go on, we are working one day closer to heaven. But for many of us, when we think about grief and fear and the depression and, again, I wouldn't term this as laziness, but I think that we can relate to this a lot because when we face the worst thing in the world that could possibly happen to us, it really doesn't seem like much else is going to be any worse. But the important question, and one of the reasons why I'm sharing this, is because even though Lewis was a reluctant prophet, he was an academic man, well-schooled, pretty much an atheist or a Gnostic, borderline. He questioned the existence. He questioned the purpose and the reason and the logic. But even though he was academic, rhetorically schooled, he knew philosophy, he had degrees, still when the question of God was brought before him, he reasoned that it was true, that God was real. And that is, of course, in another book, but in A Grief Observed, again on page 5, he goes on and he asks the question, he says, meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy, that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more empathetic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might as well be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And that seeming was as strong as this. My apologies. And that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in time of trouble? Lewis questioned where God was during his own grief. And I can say most assuredly that many of us, if not all of us, have been there. Whether or not we believe in God, our own grief may have caused us to curse him. Or I might have been right. Remember, guys, I do this from home. But many of us may have questioned him. Many of us have wondered, where are you? Why would you do this? And that is a very normal question. Yes, it is part of grief. Doubt and fear are part of grief. And, Lewis went on and he even explained, he said, I tried to put some of these thoughts into sea this afternoon. He reminded me the same thing seems to have happened to Christ. Why hast thou forsaken me? I know. Does that make it easier to understand? Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's really like? Deceive yourself no longer. Because Lewis had already converted to Christianity, of course. He is dealing with grief that is stressing his faith. That's the easiest way to explain that. And in the end, he's, or in this portion of his writing, because it progresses. He doesn't think he's in danger of stopping to believe in God, but he just doesn't want to believe that God could be bad. Let's put it that way. And, in theology, we study and learn that God is good. And Lewis was also schooled, although not theologically. So when he wrestled with grief and he wrestled with faith, he really wrestled as a layman. His interpretations were always of a layman, just a normal, everyday, average guy. I mean, he was intelligent. He was good with rhetoric. He knew philosophy. And so it was because of philosophy and rhetoric that he came to the terms that allowed him to accept first God and then Jesus Christ. And I don't have his biography handy right now, but MacArthur, who wrote his biography, did explain that Lewis came to Christianity in steps. That's why I said he was pretty much an atheist, but kind of Gnostic. But he wasn't the kind to give in to, Hellenistic thought, with, paganistic trends, New Age trends, anything like that. He was a serious man. He was a straightforward guy. It was, I don't know if he was kind of a dry guy in real life, but in Shadowlands, he does appear just pretty straightforward with things. And so to see him wrestling with grief just shows us that even those of us who struggle with our own separate grief journeys, we can relate to what Lewis is saying. But as we are looking at what he is dealing with in his faith, guys, I want to jump forward in the book. And this won't be the first time I present this book. There are many parts, even though this book is very short. It's only 76 pages total, and that includes an introduction from his stepson, who he was close with. I want to stay focused here on the portion of Lewis dealing with his faith and his grief. And part of this focus is because it is very easy to lose faith when we are grieving. So it's important for me to share this with you, especially for those of us that do have faith, and also to encourage those who may not have faith to understand that we have to battle with ourselves spiritually, but we also must remember what God is telling us. And Lewis is a good testimony. When he wrote these things, he didn't intend always on sharing them. It was, of course, shared later with permission by his family and his stepson. And it's a great help to those of us, whether we have faith or not. We can actually learn through Lewis and through his own grief of faith, which may help us to deal with grief and loss a lot better. It doesn't just apply to suicide, but I do believe this is a good subject to bring to the forefront, with this being a Christian and faith-based advocacy and support group. So my apologies, guys, for being so long-winded about that, but I jumped forward to page 46, where Lewis is still kind of contending with his grief and what he's gone through. And actually, I might go back a little bit to page 45, because he talks about a lot of things, and he says, why has no one told me these things? How easily I might have misjudged another man in the same situation, and I might have said he's got over it, he's forgotten his wife, but the truth was, he remembers her better because he has partly got over it. And that seems kind of strange, but Lewis was able to make some sense out of it. He says, you can't see anything properly while your eyes are blurred with tears. You can't, in most things, get what you want if you want it too desperately. You can't get the best out of it. Now let's have a real good talk reduces everyone to silence. So I know many times there's a lot of stigma that surrounds suicide, and it does seem to reduce everyone to silence. I can definitely relate to that. And Lewis goes on to say it is similarly the very intensity of the longing that draws the iron curtain that makes us feel that we are staring into a vacuum when we think about our dead. Them as asks, at any rate, as asks to, this is a hard word for me, importunately. Don't get it. Perhaps can't. And so perhaps with God, I've gradually been coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted. Was it my own frantic need that slammed it in my face? The time when there is nothing at all in your soul except a cry for help may just be the time when God can't give it. You are like the drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiterated cries deafen you to the voice you hope to hear. On the other hand, knock and it shall be opened. But does knocking mean hammering and kicking the door like a maniac? And there's also, to him that hath shall be given. After all, you must have a capacity to receive, or even omnipotence can't give. Perhaps your own passion temporarily destroys the capacity. For all sorts of mistakes are possible when you are dealing with him. What Lewis was saying in the beginning, like he felt that God had slammed the door in his face. In the end here, as he's coming to terms with this, he's like basically saying, was I kicking and screaming so hard that I couldn't hear the voice of God? I think we do this very often because we have to battle with these things internally. And whether we know it or not, we battle with these things spiritually. First we have to face the physical, the end of life, the death portion. And once the physical portion is over, the funeral is done, the memorials are completed, then our internal battle begins. And sometimes even before that, our internal battle begins. Often we know, maybe we are facing something, but much of the time with suicide, even though there are warning signs, there is still no warning, and we are left to pick up the pieces of our heart and to learn what it is to move forward without that person in our lives. But Lewis struggled with the internal and with the spiritual. And we all have to struggle with the mental aspect, and a huge portion of that internal spiritual fight is the fight in our own heads. The mental aspect of grief, with which comes denial, anger, sadness, tears. It's hard to find acceptance internally when we struggle with our faith or with our own mental well-being. And that's why I think that reading A Grief Observed is helpful, whether or not you're a Christian, because Lewis struggled with it on a layman's perspective. He didn't come at it like a psychologist. He didn't come at it like a priest or a pastor. He was just a normal man dealing with the loss of his wife. So I'm happy to have had an opportunity to have shared this with you today. And I look forward here in the future to sharing more about it, because there was a lot more struggle than the beginning and ending of his struggle with faith in God. The struggle leading up to her death is a different struggle than what he went through after her death, because the struggle before, he was with her. You know, they were facing it together, but the struggle after, and I think that's what's important for us to learn from, again, because with suicide, there may be warning signs, but there is never an actual warning. And we have to deal with the aftermath immediately. And if we don't get a grip on things, I'm not saying get over it, get past it. I'm saying if we don't get a grip on grief, it becomes complicated, it becomes compounded, and it turns into other mental health issues that can also lead to suicide. You know, prevention is important. Talking about things, being aware of other people's feelings, thoughts, and emotions, conditions. But postvention is just as important, because where one cycle may have come to an abrupt end, another cycle comes to an abrupt beginning, and where their story and their cycle may stop. It's there where ours begins, and we go into this alone. We do not have that person with us to tell us, hey, this is why I did what I did. This is the decision that led up to it. A lot of it's mere speculation, and many of us are trying to put the pieces together. And if we are not able to deal with our own grief inside and out, then eventually it may also tear us apart. That's why it's important to me to advocate for support for one another in order to prevent this from happening very soon again to someone else. Suicide is definitely a pandemic. It's an epidemic in our world. It may have affected many of us, all of us, most of us, very deep and very personally. But there are so many millions of others out there who need support for prevention and for postvention. So when we are able to fight that internal battle and get a grip on our grief, that's when we can start being effective in helping others to break the stigma. And I understand for many, most will never be ready to talk about it, and that's okay too. But the point is that you're able to hear and to know that you are not alone. We do encourage you to talk about things if you are struggling, if you are in crisis. I encourage you to reach out. There's the 988 Lifeline. There is text to talk at 741-741. I'm sorry, guys. I always get pretty emotional when I'm talking about the matters of the heart, but I'm a real person just like the rest of you. What I wanted to share was the National Suicide Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK 8255. Reach out if you're in crisis. If you have somebody to reach out to, let them know something is going on. And whether or not you have someone to talk to, feel free to reach out to me. And an extra little something I want to give to you guys today is develop a safety word. Something that you can say that nobody else knows what you're saying, that if you need help, your close family, your close friends, all you have to do is say Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Starlight or Moon Pie. Just make up a safety word. That way you can send a signal, even if you can't find a way to be your own voice at that moment. So, guys, as always, I appreciate everybody who has listened, some of the technical difficulties and the quirks. As a novice, it takes a lot of courage for me to just say, this doesn't have to be perfect. I want to share it with you real and raw, because I am a real person and I don't believe that we should sugarcoat anything. If you make a mistake, you make a mistake. It's okay. I want us to know that we're not perfect people. We're not supposed to be perfect people. But I really do appreciate when you listen all the way through the end, when you share this so that others can hear these things. And I appreciate you tuning in regularly if you have been so far. Again, in the near future, I'll be sharing with you about my biological mother and my daughter's suicides, both more than 30 years apart, of course. And I want to talk about nature versus nurture in my next podcast. I'm also looking to, if anybody out there has a story they want to share, support they want to give, please reach out to me. I'd love to have you on and love to hear what you would have to say and be able to share your story as well. But until next time, guys, thank you so much for your support, whenever, wherever, and as always, God bless.